Fascinating morning so far, asking this question to begin with. Who knows the name Norman Borlaug? Show of hands. Higher, I can't. Norman Borlaug, okay. That's maybe about what I guessed it would be. All right, so Norman Borlaug was born just across the Iowa border in a little town called Cresco, Iowa. And he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1977. And then he got the Congressional Gold Medal in 2006. Now, all that's important, but you should also know that he was an athlete at the University of Minnesota long before anybody said, row the boat. But most importantly of all, Norman Borlaug saved 2 billion human lives. 2 billion with a B, human lives. You see, Borlaug created hybrid, high-yield, disease-resistant corn and wheat designed for the most arid of climates. It was a technology that produced crops from the dry desert of southwest United States to the sands of the Serengeti and to the plains of Siberia. And along the way, his efforts saved 2 billion human lives. Or was it Henry Wallace? You remember who Henry Wallace was, right? He was the Secretary of Agriculture under FDR. And then he was Vice President under FDR. Is this ringing a bell now? Henry Wallace, from that elevated position of power, he created a research station in a very dry region of Mexico where a young botanist named Norman Borlaug could do his work and his research. So it was really actually Henry Wallace who effectively saved 2 billion lives, not Norman Borlaug. Or was it George Washington Carver? Surely you know who he is. I mean, we don't have time to recite his resume. George Washington Carver was that botanist, inventor, son of former slaves who became a great man of faith, the first black professor at Iowa State University, where he met a 6-year-old boy who was the son of one of his professors that would follow him around on field trips. You guessed it. That 6-year-old little boy that followed him around was none other than Henry Wallace. So George Washington Carver actually saved 2 billion lives, not Borlaug or Wallace. Or was it a woman named Susan? Susan Carver. Perhaps you've heard the historic tale of Susan Carver and her husband Moses Carver. They were the legal owners of a female slave named Mary Washington, even though they didn't believe in slavery. And this position that they took in public put them at risk for a midnight raid that came one night. And in this raid, kidnappers took Mary Washington and her 2 small children, including an infant named George. Mary and her daughter, George's mom and sister, were never heard of again. But it was Susan Carver who sent her husband to make a deal with the kidnappers. And in the middle of the night, there was an exchange of a horse, which Moses rode 10 miles to the exchange. An exchange of that horse for a naked and nearly dead infant baby boy wrapped up in a burlap sack, whom Moses pressed against the warmth of his own skin, and then made that long walk home where Susan awaited to revive and then raise George Washington Carver. Was it Borlaug? Was it Wallace? Was it Washington? Was it Susan? I don't know how we decide precisely who's responsible for saving 2 billion lives, and I'm not sure it matters. But what I do know is that a humble walk begins with the knowledge that most of who we are and much of what we accomplish will go largely unknown in the universe and did not happen by our own efforts alone. Most of who we are, much of what we accomplish will go largely unknown in the universe and did not happen by our own efforts alone. We are but one thread in the tapestry of life. We are one stone in the foundation of the world. No matter the heights of our fame or fortune, not one among us is a self-made man or woman. That's where the humble walk begins. When Micah first spoke of walking humbly with God as a requisite to a life of faith, he was dealing with a similar issue among the people that he was speaking to or writing to in this prophecy of his. The people at the time thought that worship was all about them. That somehow it was all on them and it was all about the sacrifices that they brought. So when Micah's metaphoric court case in chapter 6 begins with accusations from the plaintiff, God, against the people, Israel, the people were indignant. And they were saying to themselves, geez, whatever we bring, it's not enough. Whoever we are, it's not good enough. Micah 6, right before the words that you know so well, the people say, with what should I approach the Lord? Burnt offerings? Year-old calves? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 rams? 10,000 rivers of oil? Does the Lord require my very own firstborn child? And Micah responds and says, no. Because it's not all about you. It's about God. Eugene Peterson, in his translation of the Bible, puts it this way. That same line, walk humbly with God, he translates it as, don't take yourself so seriously. Take God seriously. Micah's basically saying, come as you are. Come open-hearted. Come open-handed. Come humbly. And leave the rest to God. There's another nice little song. I only thought of it just now. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. You know that? Just sing it back to me. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. The whole idea here is to put ourselves aside and realize that most of who we are, much of what we have, will go largely unnoticed in the universe and is not a result of our own personal efforts. That's where the humble walk begins. And this is a good week to remember that, by the way, because I bet you can think of somebody who's still drawing breath that had something to do with who you are and what you do in this day. This is a good week to thank them. Thanksgiving. To write a note, to make a call, to pay a visit. And don't forget to include God in that list of those for whom you're thankful. That's where the humble walk begins. But the humble walk finds expression then when we set aside our own needs in the interest of another person. That's when humility gets lived out in ways that matter in the world, when we're willing and able to set aside our own agenda in the interest and the needs of another. You know, today millions of Christians around the world will celebrate Christ the King Sunday. Or in the UCC, they call it the Reign of Christ Sunday. That was a liturgical celebration started just 96 years ago by Pope Pius XI. He established this last Sunday of the liturgical calendar before we start Advent, which is the first Sunday of a new year in the Christian calendar. He set this day aside for that purpose, and plenty of Protestants have picked it up along the way. But I've never been a big fan. I'm just not a fan. Not because Jesus doesn't rule my life, he does. Not because I don't revere Jesus, I do. I'm just not a fan of Christ the King Sunday because Jesus never wanted to be a king. He had plenty of chances to take that title and all that would come with it, and he never did. Instead, he always humbled himself. He set his needs or his agenda aside in the interest of another person. Never took the form of a king, but always the form of a servant. The challenge for today was not finding a good example of Jesus humbling himself. The challenge for me today was choosing from among the countless options that we had at the ready of Jesus doing this very work. The staff helped me pick this passage today because it's so layered with humility. It's layered with the humility not only of Jesus, but of the people around him when you look at it closely enough. When you put it in the context, the full context of Mark 5. Remember, I'm always begging you to put a piece of scripture in context. Just Mark 5 alone, Jesus has dealt with a very difficult character. A man who was possessed by demons. So much so that he called himself Legion, which is to say there were many within him. It was at a place called the Gerasenes. The whole scene is really kind of dark and stormy and scary. But after a miraculous and memorable healing that involved a whole herd of pigs charging off a cliff, Jesus says to the man, "Don't tell anyone." Just the humility in that statement alone. Like, this amazing thing has happened, but don't tell anyone. It was as if Jesus was saying, don't speak of this, live this. But of course, the man went out and told everybody. And before long, these crowds of people were gathered around Jesus, throngs of people, so many he could barely walk or move. And in that crowd was a man named Jairus. Jairus was a leader in the synagogue, and his daughter was sick and dying. And he came and fell humbly at Jesus' feet and begged Jesus to come and heal his daughter. But on his way to help that person, another comes along. This woman who touched his robe and is healed. Jesus didn't even stop. As far as we know, Jesus didn't even have to slow down because the healing was done. And there was a little girl and she was sick and he was on his way. But he did stop, actually. He stopped. He set his current agenda, his current needs aside to ask, who touched me? And then in typical Jesus fashion, he offers another healing on top of a healing by affirming her and giving her peace. In the meantime, Jairus' daughter, she does die. This whole scene is portrayed in a huge mural just inside our west entrance over here. The little girl does die, but Jesus goes anyway. Because not even death can dissuade the life that is in Jesus that he's ready and willing to share with all of us. But here's the point. None of this can happen in the life of someone who's too wrapped up in themselves to consider the needs of other people. A humble walk means that we're ready and willing to set our own needs aside in the interest of another person. And when we walk this way, God can make miracles happen still today. You know, just this past Thursday morning, a couple hundred people gathered just up the street for a prayer breakfast. And the whole theme of it was to celebrate the 40 years of interfaith outreach, an amazing organization right here in our neighborhoods. The millions of dollars raised, the tens of thousands of families that have been touched, all started with one small group of women led by the quietest of them all, LaDonna Hoy. They all dared to set their own needs aside and look at the needs of our community. Just one family at a time. And here we are 40 years later. You don't think miracles happen today? You're not paying attention. They happen every time. We take that first step of a humble walk, which means we set our needs aside in the interest of another. Now, the other side of that humility coin, in this passage for today, the other side of the humility is the woman who touched Jesus, right? She's been sick for how long? Long time. Remember what it said? 12 years? She's been to all the doctors, right? The doctors were really helpful, right? No, the doctors didn't do anything for her. In fact, she got worse. It would be totally easy, if not understandable, if this woman just retreated into herself and threw just a great big pity party for herself. We could almost agree and understand that. But she heard of Jesus, and in spite of all the other failed efforts, she was still willing to reach out. She humbled herself, took a risk, and without uttering a word, she asked Jesus for help. A humble walk allows others to care for us. In equal proportion to our readiness and our willingness to set aside our agenda is the need for us to be ready and willing to say to other people what it is that we need. And look, I get it. No one wants to be a burden. I get that, especially people that have been blessed with kids. Nobody wants to be a burden to their kids, but nobody wants to be a burden to their other family members. Nobody wants to be a burden to friends. Our culture not only encourages self-sufficiency, but it teaches us how to achieve it, and then it gives it to us to wear like a badge of honor. And here in the stoicism of Minnesota nice, where the stiff upper lip was pioneered and perfected, we sure don't want to put anyone out or inconvenience anyone or impose on anyone. We certainly don't want to be a burden, but sometimes that's what the humble walk looks like. If we never allow anyone to help us, to bear our burdens, to carry our load, to care for our soul, how do we achieve the call of Micah? Galatians 6 says, bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Lots of mandates, lots of requirements here. How are we to fulfill the requirement of Micah, much less the law of Christ, if we're not ready and willing to let others care for us? I would say this may be the hardest call of all in Micah's triad here. In part because, we like to bootstrap our own lives, right? Pull ourselves up and carry on. But also because right on the surface, it looks so sweet. Oh, walk humbly with God. But to take a humble walk is to eat some humble pie and to swallow our pride. I don't know how we decide precisely who's responsible for saving 2 billion lives. And again, I'm not sure it matters that we give credit. But I do know that every one of those 2 billion lives and the handful of those behind the science of it all, every one of them at some point in their lives had to humble themselves enough to let others care for them. Otherwise, we're not telling this story. And George Washington Carver's life stands as a tribute in and of itself to the humble walk. Look at George Washington Carver in closing. He knew full well that most of who he was and much of what he accomplished would go largely unknown in the universe and did not happen by his own efforts alone. George Washington Carver, his very life began with someone setting their own needs aside and at great risk was ready and willing to take interest in the needs of others. And George Washington Carver himself, from the night he nearly died as an infant to the last day he drew breath, was humble enough to let others care for him. It's a model humble walk. And you need only read the words written on his gravestone to know it to be true. The words on his gravestone, a benediction of sorts for his life. It says, he could have added fortune to fame, but caring for neither, he found happiness and honor in being helpful to the world. No wonder we're still talking about him today. And a national monument in his honor. Well, we got to close this series about our benediction. You know that word from the late Latin word benedictio, from benedicere, means to speak well of. The word benediction is defined as an invocation of divine blessing, usually at the end of a church service. Who knew? I can think of few words more fitting for a benediction, for a divine blessing, than these words of Micah 6:8. So let us again today speak them with the full assurance that we intend to pursue them, with the confident understanding not only of who first spoke them, but why. And let us allow the living of these ancient words to transform our present and future lives. Let us pray. Loving and gracious God, thank you so much for Micah. In a week where there's one day set aside to say thank you, help us to remember the mysterious power of those two simple words, to speak them to you with sincerity, to speak them to one another with affection, to speak them to those who have brought us to this point in our lives with gratitude, and to speak them to ourselves with gentleness. God, help us not only to speak these words of Micah, but to do our very best to live them out each and every day. Amen.